for the heinous and calculated murder of your two young sisters and the cruel attempt to frame your own parents. This court sentences you to death.
"12-year-old Dylan Terry murdered his two younger sisters, 10-year-old Sophia and 11-year-old Isabella, by setting fire to their bedroom while they slept. The neighborhood of Shaker Heights awoke to the wail of fire engines as flames engulfed the second story of the Terry family home, the orange glow visible for blocks against the dark winter sky. By the time first responders arrived at 3:17 a.m., the fire had already consumed most of the girls' shared bedroom, with temperatures reaching over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, making rescue impossible. Medical examiners would later determine that both Sophia and Isabella died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them, a detail that provided little comfort to the devastated community. If you're watching this video, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light, ensuring that victims like Sophia and Isabella are not forgotten. The Terry residence was a well-maintained colonial-style home on a tree-lined street, representing the middle-class stability that James and Margaret Terry had worked hard to achieve as accountants at the same downtown Cleveland firm. The couple had been working late that night, preparing for the end-of-month financial close at Harrington and Associates, leaving Dylan home with his sisters under the supervision of Mrs. Edna Green, a 67-year-old neighbor who had fallen asleep in the living room recliner. Fire investigators would initially identify the point of origin as the girls' closet, where an electrical short was suspected, but the discovery of chemical accelerants would quickly transform their investigation from tragic accident to deliberate arson. What no one could imagine in those early hours was that the perpetrator was not an intruder or vengeful client of the Terry parents, but their own son, who had methodically planned the deaths of his sisters and attempted to frame his parents for the crime. The morning after the fire, as cleanup crews sifted through the charred remains of the Terry home, Detective Mason Richardson of Cleveland's Homicide Unit stood on the driveway watching Dylan Terry, who sat wrapped in a Red Cross blanket on the back bumper of an ambulance. The boy's face was smudged with soot, his blue eyes hollow and distant. Yet Richardson would later report that something about the child's demeanor struck him as performative. Dylan was too composed, too measured in his grief, his questions too specific about what investigators had found in the ruins of his sister's room. The detective had interviewed countless survivors of family tragedies and had come to recognize the genuine shock that accompanied such loss. But Dylan's behavior seemed rehearsed, as if he were playing the role of the traumatized survivor rather than actually experiencing the trauma. It was a subtle distinction that might have gone unnoticed, if not for the trained eye of a veteran homicide detective who had spent 23 years studying human behavior in the aftermath of violence. The Terry parents arrived at the scene from their office approximately 40 minutes after the fire department, their faces contorted in unimaginable anguish as they were held back from rushing into the still smoldering house. Margaret Terry collapsed on the front lawn, her guttural screams piercing the pre-dawn stillness, while James Terry stood rigid with shock, unable to process the scene before him. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk in bathrobes and hastily donned coats, some crying, others making phone calls to spread the news throughout the tight-knit community. In the chaos and confusion, no one paid much attention to Dylan as he sat quietly observing the scene, occasionally answering questions from paramedics, checking him for injuries or shock. The boy told first responders that he had been awakened by the smoke detector and had tried to reach his sisters, but the hallway was already filled with thick smoke that drove him back. His account seemed plausible to everyone present, a harrowing tale of a child narrowly escaping death while helplessly listening to the fire consume his home and family. No one had reason to doubt him, not yet. As dawn broke over Cleveland, casting long shadows across the devastation of the Terry home, investigators began their methodical process of documenting and collecting evidence from the scene. Fire Marshal Gina Cortez noted unusual burn patterns on the bedroom floor and collected samples from areas where the fire had burned hottest, suspecting the possible use of accelerants. Crime scene technicians photographed and cataloged the items salvaged from the debris, including a partially melted plastic container that had once held matchsticks, discovered under Sophia's bed. Detective Richardson interviewed neighbors who reported nothing unusual in the days leading up to the fire, though several mentioned that the Terry family seemed like the perfect family on the surface: hard-working parents, good students, active in community events. Mrs. Green, the elderly babysitter who had survived the fire without injury, sobbed as she described how she had checked on the children at 9:30 p.m. before dozing off, watching a late-night talk show, saying repeatedly, "Those poor little angels, those poor little angels," as medical personnel administered a mild sedative to calm her distress. The initial narrative that emerged was one of a terrible tragedy, possibly the result of faulty wiring or a carelessly discarded item too close to a heat source, though the fire marshal's preliminary findings would soon challenge this assessment. By late afternoon, the Terry family had been relocated to a nearby hotel, their immediate needs addressed by the local chapter of the Red Cross, while extended family members made arrangements to travel to Cleveland. Dylan had been examined at Cleveland General Hospital and released with no physical injuries, but a recommendation for psychological counseling to address the trauma of losing his sisters. The boy's demeanor continued to perplex Detective Richardson, who observed that Dylan seemed more concerned with retrieving his phone and laptop from the house than with his parents' emotional state. When told that his devices had been recovered but were being held as standard procedure in fire investigations, Dylan's face had flickered with what the detective would later describe as a momentary but unmistakable expression of fear. This reaction, combined with the discovery of accelerant traces in the girl's bedroom, led Richardson to make a fateful decision. He would take a closer look at Dylan Terry's digital footprint. That evening, as tech specialists began examining the recovered devices, Cleveland Police Department's social media investigator, Samantha Wells, made a discovery that would change the course of the investigation. A cryptic post published on Dylan's private social media account just minutes before the first 911 call reported the fire. Sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen. Sophia and Isabella Terry were more than just statistics in a tragic case. They were vibrant young girls with promising futures, beloved by classmates, teachers, and their community in Cleveland's Shaker Heights neighborhood. Sophia, at 10 years old, was a fourth grader at Mercer Elementary, where she had recently won the school's art competition with a watercolor painting of Lake Erie at sunset, a piece that her art teacher described as showing remarkable sensitivity and technique for a child so young. Isabella, 11 and in 5th grade at the same school, was a mathematics prodigy who had been selected to represent Mercer in the Regional Math Olympiad, her bedroom shelves lined with trophies and certificates celebrating her analytical mind. The sisters shared not only a bedroom but a close bond, despite their different interests and personalities, often seen walking home from school hand in hand, their matching backpacks bouncing in rhythm as they talked and laughed together. In the aftermath of the fire, their empty desks at Mercer Elementary became impromptu memorials covered with flowers, handmade cards, and small stuffed animals from classmates struggling to comprehend the sudden absence of their friends. The Terry family photographs recovered from the home showed two girls who seemed to embody childhood joy, Isabella with her serious expression softened by a slight smile, her dark hair nearly always pulled back in a practical ponytail, while Sophia's wild curls framed a face more often caught mid-laugh than not. Their parents had documented their daughter's growth and achievements meticulously, Sophia winning her first art award in second grade, Isabella solving a complex puzzle at age 7. Both girls proudly holding up their academic achievement certificates each school year. Friends and neighbors described the sisters as inseparable, despite their different personalities, with Isabella taking on a protective role over her younger sister, helping her with homework and standing up for her when needed. Sophia, in turn, brought out Isabella's more carefree side, convincing her serious older sister to join in imaginative games and artistic projects that provided balance to Isabella's structured approach to life. Their teachers would later tell investigators that both girls had expressed concerns about their brother's increasingly moody behavior in the weeks before their deaths, with Isabella confiding to her guidance counselor that Dylan gets really mad when Mom and Dad come to my math competitions instead of his soccer games. The sisters' final day alive had been ordinary in most respects, according to witnesses and digital evidence recovered from the family's devices. School records showed both girls had perfect attendance that day, with Isabella receiving praise for her presentation on renewable energy and science class, and Sophia turning in a creative writing assignment about her future dreams of becoming an illustrator for children's books. Security footage from the school bus showed the sisters exiting at their regular stop at 3:17 p.m., with Isabella carrying a poster board for an upcoming project and Sophia clutching a folder containing art supplies. Neighborhood surveillance cameras captured them walking the 3 blocks home, stopping briefly to pet Mrs. Donovan's golden retriever, as they did most afternoons, arriving at the Terry residence at approximately 3:30 p.m. Their mother had left a note on the refrigerator instructing them to complete homework before screen time, with a reminder that she and their father would be working late that evening. The last documented interaction with the girls came at 7:46 p.m., when Margaret Terry called from work to check on them, a call that lasted 4 minutes and 23 seconds, during which she spoke primarily with Isabella about ensuring they had eaten the lasagna left in the refrigerator and reminding them to be in bed by 9:00 p.m. No one could have known that this routine conversation would be the final time she would hear her daughter's voices, or that within hours the bedroom they shared would become the site of an unimaginable crime committed by their own brother. Friends of the Terry girls recalled that both sisters had been excited about the upcoming holiday season, with Sophia already working on handmade Christmas gifts for her family, and Isabella planning the annual cookie baking schedule with scientific precision. Their backpacks, recovered relatively intact from the home's front hallway, contained evidence of typical preteen lives. Sophia's sketchbook filled with colorful drawings of animals and family members, Isabella's carefully organized binder with color-coded sections for each subject, both containing half-completed Christmas wish lists. A partially burned journal found in Isabella's desk drawer revealed entries about her excitement for the upcoming math Olympiad and her hopes of attending a prestigious STEM summer program, alongside more personal reflections about wanting to help her brother feel better about himself, because he seems really angry all the time lately. The final entry, dated just 2 days before the fire, contained a troubling observation. Dylan was in our room again today when we got home. Even though Mom told him to stay out, he said he was looking for his game controller, but his eyes looked weird, like when Dad gets really mad about work stuff. I'm going to tell Mom about it tomorrow after my test. Isabella never had the chance to share her concerns, a missed opportunity that would haunt Margaret Terry in the months that followed, as she repeatedly questioned whether she could have prevented the tragedy if she had been more attentive to the warning signs her daughter had observed. The impact of Sophia and Isabella's deaths extended far beyond their immediate family, creating ripples of grief throughout the Cleveland community where the Terry family had been active participants. Their soccer coach, Michael Brennan, organized a memorial game where players wore purple ribbons, Sophia's favorite color, and observed a moment of silence before kickoff. Mercer Elementary established a scholarship fund in the girls' names, with the first award designated to support a student showing promise in both arts and mathematics, honoring the sisters' diverse talents. The local library, where both girls were regular visitors, dedicated a children's reading corner in their memory, featuring books about resilience, sibling relationships, and overcoming challenges, themes that took on painful irony in light of how their lives ended. At the funeral service, held 10 days after the fire, when their bodies were finally released by the medical examiner, over 300 people filled St. Dominic's Church to capacity, with another 100 standing outside in the December cold, listening to the service through speakers hastily set up by the church staff. James and Margaret Terry sat in the front pew, their faces ravaged by grief, while Dylan sat between them, his expression carefully composed into what observers described as appropriate sadness. No one yet suspected that the bereaved brother was actually the architect of this tragedy, or that his seemingly grieving presence at the funeral was perhaps the most chilling performance of all in a carefully orchestrated deception that had already claimed 2 innocent lives. The 911 call that alerted authorities to the fire at the Terry residence came at 3:12 a.m. from neighbor Walter Kravitz, who had been awakened by the glow of flames visible through his bedroom window. "There's a house on fire at 1847 Maple Street," Kravitz told the dispatcher, his voice tense with urgency. "It looks bad. The second floor is really going up fast." Cleveland. Fire Department Station 7 responded within minutes, arriving to find the second story of the colonial-style home engulfed in flames, with smoke billowing into the night sky. Fire Captain Darren Walsh immediately called for backup as his team deployed hoses and prepared for a possible rescue operation, unaware that for 2 young girls inside, it was already too late. Mrs. Edna Green, the babysitter, was helped from the house by firefighter Jessica Torres, who found the elderly woman disoriented and coughing in the living room, while another firefighter located Dylan Terry already outside in the backyard, claiming he had escaped through his bedroom window when he smelled smoke. The initial responders described the fire as aggressive and fast-moving, with unusual intensity focused in one area of the home's second floor, a pattern that would later raise red flags for investigators trained to recognize signs of arson. As firefighters battled the blaze, Detective Mason Richardson arrived on the scene, having been dispatched as part of Cleveland Police Department's standard protocol for residential fires with potential casualties. Richardson's 23 years on the force, including 15 in homicide, had honed his instincts for recognizing when tragedies might have sinister underpinnings. The detective began by interviewing Dylan Terry, who sat wrapped in a blanket provided by paramedics, his answers to basic questions delivered with what Richardson would later describe as unsettling composure for a child who had allegedly just escaped a burning house where his sisters remained trapped. Dylan told Richardson that he had awakened to the smell of smoke and his home's fire alarm, tried to reach his sister's room but found the hallway impassable and escaped through his own window after yelling for Mrs. Green to get out. When Richardson asked about his parents' whereabouts, Dylan provided a detailed account of their late work schedule at Harrington and Associates, explaining that end-of-month accounting procedures often kept them at the office until midnight or later. The detective noted in his preliminary report that the suspect displayed an unusual level of situational awareness and detail retention for a child experiencing trauma, an observation that initially registered as merely noteworthy, but would gain significance as the investigation progressed. Fire Marshal Gina Cortez began her examination of the scene at first light, after firefighters had fully extinguished the blaze and structural engineers had determined it was safe to enter what remained of the house. Cortez, with 17 years of experience investigating fire scenes, immediately identified several concerning elements that contradicted the narrative of an accidental electrical fire. The burn patterns in the girl's bedroom showed clear signs of an accelerant having been used, with distinctive pooling marks on the floor between the beds and near the door. Temperature indicators suggested the fire had reached unusual intensity in specific localized areas, rather than spreading in the typical pattern of an electrical or natural gas fire. Most telling was the discovery of a partially melted plastic container under one of the beds that testing would later confirm had held matches consistent with burn patterns on the bedroom floor. This was not an accident, Cortez stated in her preliminary report filed that afternoon. The fire originated in multiple locations within the bedroom, with evidence of an accelerant being used to ensure rapid spread and maximum destruction. This fire was deliberately set by someone who wanted to make sure those girls could not escape. While the fire investigation proceeded, Detective Richardson made a crucial decision that would ultimately break the case. He requested an emergency warrant to examine all digital devices belonging to the Terry family members. The detective's instinct was driven by standard procedure in suspicious fire deaths, but also by his observation of Dylan's unusually strong reaction when told his phone and laptop had been recovered from the house but would be held as evidence. Cleveland Police Department's Digital Forensics Unit, led by Sergeant Camila Novak, began examining the devices that same day, with social media investigator Samantha Wells focusing specifically on the family's online activities in the days and weeks leading up to the fire. It was Wells who made the breakthrough discovery at 7:36 p.m., less than 17 hours after the fire was reported. "I've found something you need to see right away," she told Richardson over the phone, her voice tense with the significance of her finding. On Dylan Terry's private social media account, accessible only to approved followers, a post had appeared at 3:04 a.m., approximately 8 minutes before the first 911 call, that read, "Sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen." The timing of this cryptic message, combined with its ominous content, transformed what might have been an ambiguous statement into what Richardson immediately recognized as potential evidence of premeditation. The discovery of Dylan's social media post propelled the investigation into a new phase, with Richardson assembling a team to conduct a deeper dive into the boys' online and offline activities. Digital forensics expanded their search to include deleted files, search history, and private messages across all platforms, while detectives began interviewing Dylan's teachers, classmates, and family friends to establish a behavioral profile. The social media post proved to be just the first in a series of digital breadcrumbs that would ultimately reveal the extent of Dylan's planning and his motive. Browser history recovered from his laptop showed searches for "how to make a house fire look like an accident" and "what temperature destroys DNA evidence," both conducted in private browsing mode, but recoverable through specialized forensic tools. A thread of messages with an online gaming friend included complaints about his parents always making a big deal about Isabella's stupid math competitions, and acting like Sophia is some kind of art genius when my gaming videos get way more views than her dumb paintings. Most damning was a note found in a password-protected folder on his phone, drafted 3 weeks before the fire, that read, "They'll notice me when I'm the only one left. Maybe then I'll be enough." As these digital discoveries accumulated, Richardson requested that a child psychologist, Dr. Elaine Matsuda, join the investigative team to help interpret the emerging pattern of jealousy, resentment, and calculated revenge that was becoming increasingly evident in the evidence against 12-year-old Dylan Terry. The cryptic social media post became the thread that, when pulled, began to unravel Dylan Terry's carefully constructed facade of innocence. Detective Mason Richardson assembled his investigative team in the Cleveland Police Department's case room the morning after the discovery. The words, "Sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen," projected onto the whiteboard as they discussed its implications. "This isn't just a random thought posted in the middle of the night," Richardson told the assembled detectives and digital specialists. "This is a message, a signature, maybe even a confession, posted minutes before the fire was reported. We need to understand what it means and whether it connects to other evidence." The timing of the post particularly troubled investigators, as it suggested Dylan had been awake and active on his phone at the exact time the fire was starting, contradicting his statement that he had been asleep until awakened by smoke and alarms. Social media investigator Samantha Wells noted another critical detail. The post had been scheduled in advance using a third-party posting app, indicating premeditation rather than a spontaneous expression of emotion. This discovery shifted the investigation's focus squarely onto Dylan Terry, no longer as a surviving victim, but as a possible perpetrator who had planned his actions well in advance. With this new perspective, investigators began re-examining Dylan's statements about the night of the fire, identifying inconsistencies that had initially been attributed to trauma or confusion. In his first interview immediately after the fire, Dylan had claimed he was awakened by smoke and the home's fire alarm. Yet in a follow-up interview the next day, he mentioned hearing his sisters screaming before the alarm sounded. When Richardson gently pressed him on this discrepancy, the boy's response was telling. He paused for several seconds, his eyes shifting to the left, before stating, I heard them screaming after the alarm when I tried to reach their room." Another contradiction emerged regarding how he had attempted to save his sisters. In his initial statement, he claimed to have tried opening their bedroom door but found it too hot to touch, while later he said the hallway was filled with impenetrable smoke that prevented him from even reaching their door. Most suspicious was his detailed knowledge of exactly how the fire had progressed inside the girl's room, information he could not have observed given his claim that he never managed to enter. "The fire started in their closet," he told a victim services counselor during a supposedly therapeutic conversation, "and then spread to Isabella's bed first because it was closer, and then to Sophia's." Fire Marshal Cortez confirmed that this description accurately matched the burn patterns her team had documented, raising the question, how could Dylan know these details unless he had witnessed the fire's inception? As Dylan's account of the fire grew increasingly suspect, investigators turned their attention to his behavior in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Teachers at Lakewood Middle School reported that Dylan's academic performance had declined sharply in the previous semester, with his grades dropping from a B+ average to C's and D's across multiple subjects. His soccer coach noted that Dylan had been benched during several recent games for aggressive behavior toward teammates, particularly following an incident when his parents missed his championship game because they were attending Isabella's regional math Olympiad competition. School counselor Mark Patel shared records of 2 sessions with Dylan that had been initiated after a classroom outburst in which the boy had torn down a display of student artwork that included one of Sophia's pieces that had received special recognition. He expressed feeling invisible in his own home, Patel told investigators. His exact words were, "My parents only have eyes for the Golden Girls." Perhaps most revealing was testimony from 13-year-old Lucas Weber, who described himself as Dylan's only close friend. Weber reluctantly shared with detectives that Dylan had recently become obsessed with fire, showing him videos of burning buildings and expressing admiration for their cleansing power. He said fire was like a reset button, Weber recalled, his voice barely audible, as his mother sat beside him during the interview. He said sometimes things need to be burned away so people can see what's important. The digital forensics team's deeper analysis of Dylan's devices revealed a methodical progression from jealousy to deadly action. His search history showed a disturbing evolution, first researching how to deal with parents who have favorite children, and what to do when your siblings get all the attention, then escalating to how to get revenge on sister, and untraceable ways to hurt someone. In the month before the fire, his searches became more specific and technical: what household chemicals are flammable, how fire investigation determines arson, and how to make a delay timer for fire. These searches were interspersed with visits to news articles about parents charged with neglect or abuse, suggesting Dylan had been contemplating how to frame his parents for the crime from an early stage. Most damning was a series of deleted notes recovered from his cloud storage that outlined what appeared to be a step-by-step plan, including wait until babysitter is asleep, use matches from Dad's camping stuff, make it look like electrical problem near their beds, and get rid of evidence before firefighters come. The final entry, dated 2 days before the fire, read, "Parents working late Tuesday, perfect timing." This digital trail of premeditation, combined with the physical evidence from the fire scene, transformed what had initially seemed like a tragic accident into what prosecutor Charlotte Myers would later call one of the most calculated acts of familial homicide I've ever encountered, made all the more disturbing by the perpetrator's age. As evidence mounted against Dylan, investigators faced the delicate challenge of interviewing the Terry parents about their son's relationship with his sisters without revealing the full extent of their suspicions. James and Margaret Terry, still reeling from the loss of their daughters and the destruction of their home, met with Detective Richardson and Family Services Counselor Lucia Reyes at the hotel where they were temporarily residing. The interview, recorded with the parents' consent, revealed a family dynamic that, while not overtly dysfunctional, contained underlying tensions that had clearly festered in Dylan's mind. Margaret Terry acknowledged that her son had become increasingly withdrawn over the past year, often refusing to attend his sister's events and creating conflicts when family activities were centered around the girl's interests or achievements. James Terry appeared more defensive of his son, suggesting that Dylan's behavior was just normal teenage stuff, despite the fact that Dylan was only 12, an age miscalculation that Dr. Matsuda noted might itself indicate a pattern of parental distancing. When shown samples of Dylan's schoolwork that contained concerning imagery of isolation and resentment, Margaret broke down, revealing that Dylan had once told her, "You wouldn't even notice if I disappeared as long as the girls were still here to make you look good." Neither parent had recognized this statement as the serious threat it represented, dismissing it as typical adolescent hyperbole rather than a warning sign of deadly intentions forming in their son's mind. The forensic examination of the Terry home yielded physical evidence that aligned with and reinforced the digital trail of Dylan's planning and execution of the fire. Fire Marshal Gina Cortez's team discovered remnants of matches under Sophia's bed that chemical analysis linked to a set kept in James Terry's camping equipment in the garage, confirming that Dylan had used materials readily available in the home rather than purchasing suspicious items that might have drawn attention. Accelerant detection dogs alerted to multiple areas in the girl's bedroom, and laboratory tests identified the accelerant as a mixture of household cleaning products that had been stored in the laundry room, products that contained highly flammable chemicals when combined. Most damning was the discovery of a partial fingerprint on the melted plastic container that had held the matches, which forensic technician Vincent Morales determined was consistent with Dylan's right index finger, despite the heat damage that had compromised much of the print. The evidence suggested that Dylan had carefully positioned the accelerant in a pattern that would quickly engulf both beds while blocking the bedroom door, creating a fatal trap from which his sisters had no chance of escape. These physical findings, combined with the digital evidence of premeditation, formed the foundation of what prosecutor Charlotte Myers described as an ironclad case of deliberate, premeditated murder, regardless of the perpetrator's age. Beyond the technical evidence, investigators worked to establish the psychological pattern that had led Dylan to commit such an extreme act of violence against his sisters. Dr. Elaine Matsuda, the child psychologist assigned to the case, conducted a comprehensive review of Dylan's academic and medical records, interviews with his teachers and peers, and an analysis of his digital communications and creative outputs. Her assessment identified a pattern of what she termed pathological jealousy and narcissistic injury that had developed over several years. Dylan's sense of self-worth became increasingly dependent on parental attention and validation, Dr. Matsuda wrote in her report. When that attention was divided among 3 children, with his sisters often receiving praise for specific achievements, he experienced this not as a normal family dynamic, but as a profound personal rejection. The psychologist noted that Dylan's online activity showed a child who constantly monitored his sister's successes and his parents' reactions to them, keeping a mental scorecard of instances where he perceived they received more attention, praise, or resources than he did. This perception was exacerbated by developmental factors. As a 12-year-old boy entering early adolescence, Dylan was naturally seeking greater autonomy and identity formation at precisely the time when his sisters, at ages 10 and 11, were achieving concrete successes in areas valued by their parents and community. The investigation also revealed how Dylan had meticulously attempted to frame his parents for the murder of their daughters, a strategy that suggested both sophisticated planning and a profound disconnect from normal emotional and moral development. In the days before the fire, he had used his father's work computer to search for life insurance policies for children and parents who kill for insurance money, creating a digital trail that initially led investigators to consider James Terry as a person of interest. He had also planted a handwritten note in his mother's desk drawer that read, "Can't take their fighting anymore. Need peace and quiet," which was discovered during the execution of a search warrant at the Harrington and Associates office where both parents worked. Most calculated was Dylan's creation of a fake email account in his father's name, which he used to send messages to a fictional recipient discussing financial problems and the burden of carrying this family in the weeks before the fire. Detective Richardson noted in his case summary that the suspect demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to create false evidence trails and attempted to exploit investigative assumptions about family homicide cases, showing a level of manipulation and forethought rarely seen in offenders of any age, let alone a 12-year-old. The cornerstone of the prosecution's case remained the cryptic social media post. Sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen, which digital forensics confirmed had been scheduled to publish automatically at 3:04 a.m., approximately when the fire would have been in its early stages. This timing suggested Dylan had set the fire, then positioned himself to appear as if he had escaped after being awakened by the smoke, creating both physical and temporal distance between himself and the crime. Samantha Wells's further investigation of Dylan's online presence uncovered a pattern of increasingly dark content in the months leading up to the murders, including his participation in online forums discussing family favoritism and sibling rivalry, where he had posted under the username Invisible Son about feeling erased by his parents' attention to his sisters. In one particularly disturbing thread titled, "When You've Had Enough," Dylan had written, "What if the problem children just disappeared? Would the parents finally see who was really the perfect kid all along?" Other forum members had responded with supportive comments about managing jealousy through communication or finding validation outside the family, but Dylan's responses had grown increasingly fixated on more permanent solutions. This digital trail provided crucial context for understanding the foundational social media post, not as an isolated cryptic message, but as the culmination of a documented psychological progression from jealousy to homicidal ideation. As investigators assembled these elements into a comprehensive case, they also explored how Dylan had managed to execute his plan without raising alarms from Mrs. Green, the elderly babysitter who had been present in the home that night. Interview transcripts revealed that Dylan had deliberately cultivated a relationship with Mrs. Green over the previous months, repeatedly offering to make her tea in the evening, which gave him access to her regular medication. Toxicology screening of Mrs. Green's blood, taken when she was treated for smoke inhalation, showed elevated levels of diphenhydramine, an over-the-counter sleep aid that investigators later found had been crushed and added to the woman's nightly chamomile tea. While not enough to cause serious harm, the dosage was sufficient to ensure she would sleep deeply through the critical early stages of the fire, delaying the discovery and emergency response. This calculated step eliminated a potential witness and obstacle to Dylan's plan, demonstrating a chilling level of foresight and determination to succeed in his deadly mission. The manipulation of Mrs. Green, combined with the timing of the scheduled social media post, the planted evidence implicating his parents, and the precise placement of accelerants to ensure maximum damage, painted a picture not of an impulsive act of jealousy, but of a calculated execution of a plan designed to eliminate his sisters while positioning himself as both a survivor and a victim, finally, in his mind, the center of his parents' attention and concern. The formal arrest of 12-year-old Dylan Terry took place on December 7, 2022, just 8 days after the fire that claimed his sisters' lives and less than 24 hours after the Terry family had held a memorial service for Sophia and Isabella. Detective Mason Richardson made the difficult decision to take Dylan into custody at the hotel where the family was staying, rather than at the funeral home or during the memorial service, a choice he later described as balancing the needs of the investigation with basic human decency. James and Margaret Terry were present when Richardson and 2 uniformed officers arrived at their hotel suite, the detective beginning with the formal notification that their son was being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, arson, and attempted framing of another for a criminal act. Margaret Terry collapsed into a chair, her face a mask of shock and disbelief, while James immediately became combative, demanding to know what evidence they could possibly have against a grieving 12-year-old boy who just lost his sisters. The moment of arrest was captured on the officers' body cameras, preserving the image of Dylan standing utterly still as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. His expression not one of shock or protest, but rather what Richardson would later describe in his report as a look of resignation, as if he had been waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. The interrogation of Dylan Terry took place at Cleveland's Juvenile Justice Center, conducted in accordance with protocols for questioning minors in capital cases, with both a guardian ad litem and Dylan's court-appointed attorney Catherine Winters present throughout. The interview room was designed to be less intimidating than standard police interrogation rooms, with comfortable seating and subdued lighting. But the gravity of the situation was unmistakable as Detective Richardson carefully read Dylan his Miranda rights, ensuring the boy acknowledged his understanding of each one. For the first 43 minutes of the recorded interview, Dylan maintained his innocence, repeating the story he had told from the beginning about being awakened by smoke and trying unsuccessfully to reach his sisters. His demeanor remained composed, his voice steady as he answered questions with the careful precision that had initially struck Richardson as unusual for a child his age. It was only when Richardson placed a tablet on the table between them, displaying screenshots of Dylan's online searches about arson techniques and his cryptic social media post, that the first crack appeared in his facade. "I didn't write that," Dylan insisted, though his voice had risen slightly in pitch, and his eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity that betrayed his concern. "Someone must have hacked my account." The turning point in the interrogation came when Richardson presented the evidence in a deliberate sequence designed to dismantle Dylan's defenses, piece by piece. First the digital trail of searches and notes, then the physical evidence from the fire scene, followed by testimony from his friend Lucas about his fascination with fire, and finally the toxicology report showing that Mrs. Green had been drugged with sleep medication. With each new piece of evidence, Dylan's composure visibly eroded. His shoulders hunched forward, his responses became shorter, and he began to display physical signs of stress, such as repeatedly touching his face and bouncing his leg under the table. After 2 hours of methodical questioning, Richardson shifted his approach, moving from establishing the facts of the crime to exploring the underlying motive. "Dylan," he said, his voice deliberately gentle, "I think I understand why you might have felt you needed to do this. Your post said, 'Sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen.' Was that how you felt at home? Forgotten?" The question hung in the air for 17 seconds of recorded silence before Dylan's carefully constructed wall finally collapsed, his face crumpling as tears filled his eyes for the first time since the investigation began. "They never saw me," he whispered, the words barely audible on the recording. "It was always Sophia's art or Isabella's math. Nobody came to my games. Nobody cared about my videos. It was like I was invisible in my own house." Once the initial admission had been made, Dylan's account of the events leading up to and including the night of the fire emerged in a torrent of words, alternating between cold, detailed description of his actions and emotional justifications for them. He described how he had researched methods for starting fires that would appear accidental, settling on a combination of household chemicals that would burn hot enough to destroy evidence. He explained how he had systematically planted false evidence to implicate his parents, including creating the fake email account and drafting the note found in his mother's desk. When asked about drugging Mrs. Green, Dylan displayed a disturbing lack of empathy, stating matter-of-factly that she needed to be asleep so she wouldn't interfere, and showing no concern for the risk to her life from the fire or the medication. The most chilling moment of the interrogation came when Richardson asked directly about Dylan's sisters and whether he had considered the pain they would experience in their final moments. Dylan's response revealed the depth of his psychological disconnect. "They were already dead to me," he said, his voice flat. "They were just the reason I didn't exist anymore. I just made the outside match what was already true on the inside." The interrogation continued for nearly 6 hours, with breaks mandated by juvenile questioning protocols, during which Dylan provided increasingly detailed information about both his actions and his thought processes. He admitted to entering his sister's room after they had fallen asleep, pouring the accelerant mixture in strategic locations, and igniting it with matches taken from his father's camping supplies. He described waiting until he was certain the fire had taken hold before retreating to his own room, opening his window to explain the absence of smoke inhalation, and then positioning himself in the backyard to be discovered by first responders. Perhaps most disturbing was his explanation for scheduling the social media post to publish automatically during the fire. "I wanted people to understand why I did it," he said. "I wanted everyone to know that I wasn't invisible anymore." When Richardson asked if he felt remorse for taking his sisters' lives, Dylan's response reflected a profound emotional and moral deficit. "I feel bad that everyone's so upset," he said after a long pause, "but I don't feel bad about what I did. For the first time, my parents are thinking about me all the time instead of them. They finally see me now." This statement, captured in the official transcript and later played in court, would come to encapsulate the case's most troubling aspect, not just the horror of a 12-year-old methodically murdering his sisters, but his fundamental inability to recognize the moral gravity of his actions or experience appropriate emotional response to the suffering he had caused. The final phase of the interrogation addressed Dylan's attempt to frame his parents for the murders, a strategy that revealed both sophistication beyond his years and a profound misunderstanding of human grief. "I thought if they got blamed, it would be perfect," he told Richardson. "They'd be punished for always putting the girls first. And I'd get to go live with my grandparents in Michigan, where I could start over and be the only kid." When asked how he had learned about planting false evidence, Dylan referenced crime shows he had watched and online forums where people discussed perfect murders and techniques for misleading investigators. He had meticulously researched cases where parents had been convicted of killing their children, studying the evidence patterns that had led to those convictions and attempting to replicate them in his own crime scene. This level of planning and awareness of forensic techniques struck investigators as extraordinarily sophisticated for a 12-year-old, with Dr. Matsuda noting in her assessment that Dylan demonstrated cognitive capabilities well beyond his chronological age, paired with an emotional and moral development that appears significantly arrested. By the conclusion of the interrogation, Dylan had provided a full confession, admitting to every element of the crimes with which he was charged, while maintaining the distorted justification that his actions were a necessary response to the perceived injustice of his family situation. Richardson closed the session by asking if there was anything else Dylan wanted to say for the record, to which the boy responded with a statement that would later be quoted by both prosecution and defense. "I just wanted my parents to notice me for once. Is that really so wrong?" The Cuyahoga County Courthouse stood imposing against the gray Cleveland sky on March 13, 2023, as the trial of Ohio versus Dylan Terry began, drawing national media attention as one of the youngest defendants ever to face capital murder charges in the state's history. The historic courtroom, with its oak-paneled walls and soaring ceiling, was filled to capacity with journalists, legal observers, and members of the community still reeling from the shocking case that had unfolded in their midst over the winter months. Judge Eleanor Blackwell, a 30-year veteran of the bench known for her firm but fair handling of juvenile cases, entered the courtroom at precisely 9:00 a.m., her expression grave as she surveyed the assembled crowd. At the defense table sat 12-year-old Dylan Terry, nearly unrecognizable from the composed boy who had been arrested 3 months earlier. His face had thinned, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his previously neatly kept hair had grown out, falling across his forehead as he stared downward at his hands clasped on the table before him. Beside him, defense attorney Catherine Winters placed a protective hand on his shoulder, a gesture that seemed to emphasize his youth and vulnerability despite the horrific crimes with which he stood charged. The contrast between the defendant's physical smallness and the enormity of his alleged actions created a dissonance that would permeate every aspect of the proceedings to follow. Prosecutor Charlotte Myers rose to deliver the state's opening statement, her tall figure commanding attention as she approached the jury box where 12 citizens had been selected after an exhaustive voir dire process that had eliminated anyone with personal connections to the Terry family or strong pre-existing opinions about trying juveniles as adults. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Myers began, her voice resonant in the hushed courtroom, "this case will challenge you in ways you cannot yet imagine. You will hear evidence that a 12-year-old boy methodically planned and executed the murders of his 2 younger sisters by setting fire to their bedroom as they slept. You will learn that this was not an impulsive act of childish anger, but a calculated crime designed to eliminate what the defendant perceived as competition for his parents' attention and affection." Myers walked slowly along the jury box, making brief eye contact with each juror as she continued. "The evidence will show that Dylan Terry researched arson techniques drugged the elderly babysitter to prevent her intervention, positioned accelerants to ensure his sisters could not escape, and even attempted to frame his own parents for the crime. Most telling of all, you will see that minutes before flames engulfed his sister's bedroom, the defendant scheduled a social media post that read, "Sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen," a digital signature on his deadly work, a message to the world explaining why Sophia and Isabella Terry had to die. The prosecutor then methodically outlined the state's case, using a large screen to project a timeline of events beginning months before the fire and culminating in the deaths of Sophia and Isabella Terry. Myers emphasized three key elements that would form the backbone of the prosecution's argument: premeditation, as evidenced by Dylan's digital searches and preparations; execution, demonstrated through the forensic evidence from the fire scene; and motive, revealed through the boy's own words in his confession and online activities. This is not a case about whether Dylan Terry committed these acts. He has admitted to them, Myers told the jury. This is a case about accountability and justice. The defendant's age makes this situation tragic, but it does not negate the deliberate nature of his choices or the devastating consequences of his actions. As she concluded her opening statement, Myers addressed head-on the question that hung over the proceedings. You may ask yourselves how a child could conceive and carry out such a crime. The evidence will show that Dylan Terry may be chronologically 12 years old, but he demonstrated the calculating foresight of someone much older in planning these murders. He understood exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. He knew his sisters would die, and he wanted them to die. In the eyes of the law, and in the interest of justice for Sophia and Isabella, he must be held accountable as if he were the adult he chose to become when he decided to take their lives. Defense attorney Catherine Winters approached the jury with a markedly different demeanor, her voice softer and her movements more measured, as if inviting the jurors into a more intimate conversation about a case that had already been sensationalized in the media. What happened to Sophia and Isabella Terry was a tragedy beyond words, she began, acknowledging the weight of grief that hung over the proceedings. No one in this courtroom, least of all my client, disputes that fact or seeks to diminish the profound loss suffered by everyone who loved these young girls. Winters then pivoted to the central argument of the defense, that Dylan Terry was fundamentally a child whose actions, however terrible, stemmed from a mind that was not yet fully developed and a psychology that had been warped by perceived emotional neglect. The prosecution has outlined for you what happened on the night of November 31st, 2022. Our role is to help you understand why it happened and, critically, who was truly responsible. She gestured toward Dylan, who remained looking down at the table. You see before you not a calculating criminal mastermind, as the prosecution suggests, but a deeply troubled child whose emotional and psychological needs went unrecognized and unaddressed for years, creating a perfect storm of desperation, magical thinking, and distorted problem-solving that culminated in this tragedy. Winters outlined the defense's strategy of presenting Dylan not as innocent, but as incapable of the level of criminal intent required for first-degree murder charges, particularly within the framework of adult criminal proceedings. Brain science tells us unequivocally that the adolescent brain is not fully developed, she explained, particularly in areas responsible for impulse control, understanding long-term consequences, and moral reasoning. Dylan's actions, while methodical in execution, reflect a child's magical thinking about solving his problems in the only way his desperate mind could conceive. The defense attorney then introduced the concept that would form the foundation of their case, that Dylan suffered from what experts would term pathological jealousy, exacerbated by parental differential treatment, creating a psychological pressure cooker that had been building for years before finally exploding in violence. You will hear testimony from mental health experts who evaluated Dylan and found significant evidence of emotional neglect and psychological damage inflicted not by deliberate abuse, but by a family dynamic in which he was repeatedly made to feel less valued, less loved, and less visible than his sisters. Winters concluded by asking the jury to approach the case not just as a legal matter, but as a human tragedy with multiple victims, including Dylan himself. As you listen to the evidence in this case, I ask you to remember that the defendant was 12 years old when these events occurred, a child whose brain, personality, and moral framework are still forming. Whatever you may feel about his actions, justice is not served by treating a broken child as a fully formed adult. Following the opening statements, Judge Blackwell instructed the prosecution to call its first witness, and Detective Mason Richardson took the stand, inaugurating the evidentiary phase of what would become one of Cleveland's most closely watched trials in decades. Richardson, with his silver-streaked hair and measured demeanor, presented an authoritative figure as he was sworn in, and began to recount the investigation from its earliest moments. The detective described arriving at the scene of the fire and his initial impression of Dylan Terry as unusually composed given the circumstances. In my 23 years of police work, I've interviewed many survivors of traumatic events, Richardson testified. Children who have witnessed or escaped violence typically display certain patterns of behavior: disorientation, emotional volatility, difficulty focusing or providing coherent accounts. Dylan displayed none of these. He was calm, articulate, and remarkably detailed in his recollection of events, which initially I attributed to shock, but later recognized as something quite different. Using a series of photographs and diagrams, Richardson walked the jury through the fire scene, the discovery of accelerants in the girl's bedroom, and the progressive uncovering of evidence that pointed to Dylan as the perpetrator rather than the survivor he claimed to be. The most powerful moment of Richardson's testimony came when Prosecutor Myers entered into evidence the video recording of Dylan's confession, which was played in full for the jury. The courtroom fell completely silent as they watched the progression from Dylan's initial denials to his eventual admission, his voice small but clear as he described setting the fire and his reasons for doing so. Several jurors visibly reacted to the moment when Dylan stated that his sisters were already dead to me and his assertion that he didn't feel remorse for his actions. As the video concluded, the camera captured James and Margaret Terry seated in the front row of the gallery, their faces streaked with tears as they confronted the full reality of what their son had done and the disturbing rationale behind his actions. Myers returned to Richardson with a final question. Detective, in your professional experience, does this confession reflect an impulsive act or a calculated crime? Richardson's response was measured but unequivocal. This confession, along with the physical and digital evidence we uncovered, indicates one of the most thoroughly planned homicides I've ever investigated, regardless of the perpetrator's age. Dylan Terry didn't snap or lose control. He executed a strategy developed over weeks, if not months, with clear intent to end his sisters' lives and potentially implicate his parents in their deaths. As the first day of trial concluded, the gravity of what lay ahead was palpable in the courtroom, not just a determination of guilt or innocence, but a reckoning with profound questions about childhood development, family dynamics, criminal intent, and the nature of justice itself when the accused is barely old enough to understand the permanence of the lives he has taken. The prosecution's case continued to build momentum on the third day of trial with the testimony of digital forensics expert Samantha Wells, whose analysis of Dylan Terry's online activities provided crucial insight into his state of mind before the murders. Wells, with her precisely styled bob and wire-rimmed glasses, presented as the consummate professional as she methodically walked the jury through the digital breadcrumbs that had led investigators to identify Dylan as the perpetrator. The foundational piece of evidence in our investigation was the social media post published at 3:04 a.m. on the night of the fire, Wells testified, as the message was displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. Sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen. Using forensic timestamps and access logs, Wells demonstrated that this post had been scheduled 26 hours before it appeared online, proving that Dylan had planned the timing of both the message and, by extension, the fire itself. This was not a spontaneous expression of emotion, Wells explained, but a carefully timed component of a larger plan, essentially a signature or artist's statement meant to accompany his actions. The expert then presented a comprehensive timeline of Dylan's internet searches in the months leading up to the fire, showing a progression from general queries about sibling jealousy to specific research on arson techniques, culminating in searches about how investigators determine the cause of fires and methods for framing others for crimes. The jury appeared particularly affected when Wells introduced evidence from Dylan's private online communications with gaming friends and forum participants, in which he had expressed escalating resentment toward his sisters. In one message sent 3 weeks before the fire, Dylan had written, "Sometimes I think my life would be perfect if I were an only child. My parents wouldn't have anyone to compare me to then." Another exchange showed him discussing a hypothetical scenario in which problem siblings disappeared, asking others how they thought parents would react. Most disturbing was a note found in a password-protected app on his phone, dated just 4 days before the fire. "They'll be more famous dead than alive. Everyone will talk about them, cry about them, remember them forever. But I'll still be here, and finally, they'll have to see me." Wells explained that this digital evidence revealed not only premeditation, but a fundamental misunderstanding of death's permanence and consequences, reflecting what psychologists would later term magical thinking about how the family dynamic would be transformed by his sister's absence. As Wells concluded her testimony, prosecutor Charlotte Myers asked her professional assessment of the level of planning evident in the digital record. "In my 15 years of digital forensics work," Wells responded without hesitation, "I have rarely seen this level of methodical digital preparation in any perpetrator, regardless of age. The suspect's efforts to research methods, cover his tracks, and even create a narrative around his actions demonstrate sophisticated planning and awareness of how digital evidence works in criminal investigations." Following Wells, the prosecution called Dr. Amita Golan, the state's forensic psychologist who had conducted a court-ordered evaluation of Dylan Terry in the months between his arrest and trial. Dr. Golan, with her calm demeanor and precise language, testified that while Dylan's chronological age was 12, his cognitive functioning in certain areas was more consistent with an older adolescent. Dylan displays an unusual combination of advanced cognitive capabilities, particularly in areas of planning, verbal reasoning, and technological understanding, paired with severely underdeveloped emotional and moral reasoning, Dr. Golan explained. This creates a dangerous disconnect where he has the intellectual capacity to plan and execute complex actions without the emotional maturity to understand their impact or the moral framework to recognize their wrongfulness. The psychologist went on to describe Dylan's disturbing lack of empathy when discussing his sisters, noting that during their sessions, he spoke about them primarily in terms of how they affected his position in the family, rather than as individuals with their own lives, feelings, and right to exist. When I asked Dylan directly if he understood that his sisters would never grow up, never have experiences or relationships, never have children of their own, he responded by saying, "That's kind of the point. Now everyone will remember them exactly how they were when my parents thought they were perfect." Dr. Golan's testimony then turned to the central issue of Dylan's motive, the pathological jealousy and perception of parental favoritism that had festered until it manifested in deadly violence. What we see in this case is not simply normal sibling rivalry that escalated, she explained, but a pattern of what we term pathological jealousy, in which Dylan's entire sense of self and worth became dependent on his perception of his place in the family hierarchy. His sisters' academic and artistic achievements, and the praise they received from their parents, were experienced not as separate from his own identity, but as direct threats to his very existence. The psychologist described how, in Dylan's distorted thinking, eliminating his sisters seemed like a logical solution to his problem. If they were gone, his parents' attention would naturally focus solely on him, fulfilling his desperate need for recognition and validation. This explanation, while offering insight into Dylan's psychology, did not diminish the calculated nature of his actions in Dr. Golan's assessment. Understanding the psychological drivers behind this crime does not negate the fact that Dylan demonstrated the capacity to plan meticulously, anticipate obstacles, and execute a complex series of actions with clear awareness that his sisters would die as a result. He knew what death meant. He intended that outcome specifically because of what death meant, the permanent removal of what he perceived as competition for parental love and attention. The defense began its case on the 6th day of trial with testimony from Dr. Elaine Matsuda, the child psychologist who had been involved with the investigation from an early stage and who offered a significantly different interpretation of Dylan's psychological state and capacity for criminal intent. What we're seeing with Dylan is the tragic outcome of a developmental perfect storm, Dr. Matsuda testified, her soft voice compelling the jury to lean forward to catch every word. A child entering early adolescence, a developmental stage already characterized by identity formation and heightened sensitivity to perceived social hierarchies, combined with a family dynamic that, however unintentionally, consistently positioned him as less successful, less special, and less worthy of attention than his sisters. Dr. Matsuda introduced the concept of invisible child syndrome, describing how children who feel chronically overlooked in their families can develop distorted perceptions and desperate strategies to be seen and valued. In Dylan's mind, the situation was existential, not simply that he was receiving less attention, but that he was literally disappearing, becoming non-existent in his family's narrative. His desperate action, as terrible as it was, represented a child's magical thinking about how to solve an intolerable psychological situation. Unlike the prosecution's expert, Dr. Matsuda emphasized the neurobiological limitations of the pre-adolescent brain, particularly in areas of consequential thinking, impulse control, and moral reasoning. The human brain doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s, she explained, using simplified diagrams to illustrate her points for the jury. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for understanding long-term consequences, weighing moral complexities, and regulating emotional impulses, is dramatically underdeveloped in a 12-year-old. This biological reality is why we generally don't hold children to the same standards of criminal responsibility as adults. They literally lack the neural architecture necessary for adult-level reasoning and decision-making. When defense attorney Catherine Winters asked directly about Dylan's capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder, Dr. Matsuda was unequivocal. Dylan understood that his actions would cause his sister's deaths in a concrete sense, but he fundamentally could not comprehend the full moral, emotional, and existential implications of that outcome in the way an adult could. His brain simply hasn't developed the capacity for that level of understanding. This testimony directly challenged the prosecution's portrayal of Dylan as functionally adult-like in his planning and execution of the crime, suggesting instead that his actions, while methodical, reflected a child's limited and distorted understanding of consequences rather than adult criminal intent. Some of the most compelling testimony came from Dylan's sixth-grade teacher, Melanie Donahue, who described observing a dramatic change in his behavior and academic performance over the school year preceding the fire. Dylan had always been a bright, engaged student with lots of friends and a natural leadership quality, Donahue testified, her expression troubled as she recalled the transformation she had witnessed. But something shifted that fall. He became withdrawn, his grades began to slip, and I noticed he would become visibly agitated whenever classroom discussions or activities involved family topics. Donahue described a parent-teacher conference in October 2022, just 6 weeks before the fire, during which she had expressed concerns about Dylan's behavioral changes to James and Margaret Terry. I specifically mentioned that Dylan seemed to be struggling with self-esteem issues and suggested he might benefit from counseling, she recalled. Mrs. Terry mentioned that they were very busy with Isabella's Math Olympiad preparations and Sophia's art portfolio development for a special program, but that they would try to find time to look into it after those commitments were completed. The teacher's voice faltered as she continued, "I remember Dylan's expression when his mother said that. It was like watching a light go out. He simply nodded and said, 'It's okay, I know they're more important.'" This testimony provided a devastating glimpse into the family dynamic that had preceded the tragedy, suggesting that warning signs had been visible but not adequately addressed in the critical months before Dylan's desperate act. As the trial entered its second week, both prosecution and defense called expert witnesses to interpret the foundational social media post that had become central to understanding Dylan's mindset. Social media psychology expert Dr. Marcus Chen, testifying for the prosecution, characterized the post as a clear declaration of intent and motive, the digital equivalent of a manifesto meant to explain and justify the violence that would follow. In contrast, adolescent development specialist Dr. Rebecca Finley, called by the defense, interpreted the same message as a cry for help from a child who felt invisible, using the language and platform accessible to him to express profound emotional distress rather than a calculated announcement of violence. These competing interpretations of the same evidence underscored the fundamental question at the heart of the trial. Was Dylan Terry a calculating killer who happened to be chronologically young, or was he a deeply troubled child whose limited understanding of consequences had led to an unimaginable tragedy? As each expert added layers to the jury's understanding of the case, the lines between these perspectives blurred and shifted, challenging simplistic narratives about children, violence, and moral responsibility in ways that would reverberate far beyond the confines of the Cleveland courtroom, where a 12-year-old boy's fate hung in the balance. After 13 days of testimony from 38 witnesses, hundreds of pieces of evidence, and emotional closing arguments from both prosecution and defense, the fate of Dylan Terry was placed in the hands of the 12 jurors who filed solemnly out of Courtroom 7B at the Cuyahoga County Courthouse on the afternoon of March 29, 2023. Judge Eleanor Blackwell instructed them to consider both the evidence presented and the unique circumstances of the defendant's age, emphasizing that while Ohio law permitted trying a juvenile as an adult in cases of exceptional severity, they must determine whether Dylan possessed the capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. The jury's deliberation room, a wood-paneled chamber with a large conference table and chairs worn smooth by decades of use, became the stage for what jury forewoman Denise Martinez would later describe as the most difficult moral and ethical discussion any of us had ever participated in. For 6 hours and 23 minutes, the 12 citizens of Cleveland wrestled not only with questions of evidence and testimony, but with fundamental concepts of childhood, culpability, and justice that challenged their previously held beliefs about the bright line between innocence and guilt. Their deliberations took place against the backdrop of a courthouse surrounded by media trucks and divided groups of protesters, some calling for maximum punishment to honor Sophia and Isabella, others advocating for rehabilitation rather than retribution for a defendant who was, whatever his actions, still a child. Inside the courtroom, as the hours of deliberation stretched on, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. James and Margaret Terry sat rigid in the front row, their expressions unreadable as they confronted the impossible reality of their situation, having lost 2 children to violence and now facing the potential loss of their remaining child to the justice system. Dylan remained at the defense table beside Catherine Winters, his small frame dwarfed by the courtroom furniture, occasionally fidgeting with a stress ball the psychologists had recommended to help manage his anxiety. Prosecutor Charlotte Myers reviewed her notes at the state's table, her face grave as she prepared for either outcome. At 5:47 p.m., a message was relayed to Judge Blackwell that the jury had reached a verdict, sending a ripple of tension through the assembled spectators, journalists, and legal teams. As the courtroom filled for the verdict announcement, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the jury filing back into their box, their faces solemn with the weight of their decision. Judge Blackwell addressed them formally. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Forewoman Martinez stood, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her expression. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk of the court received the verdict form and passed it to Judge Blackwell, who reviewed it briefly before returning it for reading. In the case of the state of Ohio versus Dylan Terry, on the count of murder in the first degree of Sophia Terry, we the jury find the defendant. Martinez paused, visibly gathering herself before continuing, "Guilty." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom as she continued, "On the count of murder in the first degree of Isabella Terry, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the count of arson in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty." Each pronouncement fell like a hammer in the hushed courtroom, confirming that after considering all testimony and evidence, the jury had determined that despite his age, Dylan Terry had possessed the capacity to form specific intent and had acted with premeditation in taking his sisters' lives. Margaret Terry collapsed against her husband's shoulder, a broken sound escaping her as the full reality of the verdict registered, while James stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle visibly twitched in his cheek. At the defense table, Dylan showed little outward reaction to the announcement of his fate, his expression remaining as blank as it had been throughout much of the trial, a detail that several jurors would later cite as influencing their decision, interpreting his lack of visible emotion as further evidence of his detachment from the moral gravity of his actions. Judge Blackwell ordered a pre-sentencing investigation and scheduled the sentencing hearing for April 17, 2023, allowing time for additional psychological evaluations and impact statements to be prepared. As the courtroom began to clear following the verdict, the unprecedented nature of the case generated immediate and polarized reactions across Cleveland and beyond. Outside the courthouse, where the verdict was announced to the waiting crowds via live streams and reporters rushing to deliver the news, spontaneous demonstrations formed on both sides of the issue. Supporters of the verdict held signs with photographs of Sophia and Isabella, many bearing the message, "Justice for the Terry girls," while opponents of trying juveniles as adults gathered with placards reading, "Children are not disposable," and "Rehabilitation, not retribution." Local news outlets broadcast live from the courthouse steps, where legal experts weighed in on the historic nature of the case and its potential implications for juvenile justice nationwide. Professor Harriet Douglas from Cleveland State University's Criminal Justice Department told Channel 5 News This verdict represents a significant departure from traditional approaches to juvenile offenders, regardless of the heinousness of the crime. The jury's decision suggests a shift in how we conceptualize childhood culpability and raises profound questions about the purpose of our justice system when dealing with the most troubling cases involving children who commit adult crimes. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later drew even more intense media attention, with national networks setting up remote broadcasts outside the courthouse and legal observers from across the country requesting seats in the gallery. The hearing began with victim impact statements, including a devastating address from James and Margaret Terry, who found themselves in the impossible position of speaking both as the parents of the murdered victims and as the parents of the convicted killer. Every morning, I wake up to the unbearable reality that 2 of my children are gone forever, and my remaining child is responsible for their absence, Margaret Terry told the court, her voice breaking repeatedly as she spoke. There are no words to describe living in this purgatory of grief and guilt, love and horror, mourning and responsibility. We failed all 3 of our children in ways we are only beginning to understand. James Terry, speaking more directly to the issue of sentencing, made a plea for rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. Dylan's actions were monstrous, but he is not a monster. He is a deeply troubled child who needed help we didn't recognize or provide in time. We have lost Sophia and Isabella forever. Please don't take our son from us too, not through a sentence that offers no hope of healing or redemption. The courtroom remained silent as the couple returned to their seats, the impossible complexity of their situation casting a somber shadow over the proceedings that would determine their son's fate. After hearing arguments from both prosecution and defense regarding appropriate sentencing, Judge Blackwell addressed the court in what would become one of the most closely analyzed judicial statements in Ohio's legal history. This case presents the court with a profound dilemma, she began, her measured tone belying the gravity of the decision before her. On one hand, we have a defendant who has been convicted of deliberately taking 2 innocent lives in a manner that demonstrates planning, deception, and awareness of wrongdoing. On the other hand, that defendant is chronologically and developmentally a child, with all the limitations in reasoning, impulse control, and moral understanding that entails. The judge acknowledged the competing priorities of justice, public safety, punishment, and rehabilitation that had to be balanced in her decision, noting the absence of clear precedent for a case involving a defendant so young convicted of such serious crimes. After methodically reviewing the evidence, psychiatric evaluations, and applicable law, Judge Blackwell announced her decision. Dylan Terry is hereby sentenced to be held in juvenile detention until the age of 18, at which time a comprehensive reassessment will determine whether he should be transferred to adult corrections or considered for supervised release. This sentence mandates intensive psychological treatment throughout his detention, with quarterly progress evaluations to be submitted to this court. The judge then addressed Dylan directly. "Young man, you have committed acts of unimaginable cruelty and calculation, but the law recognizes, as must I, that you remain a child with the capacity for profound change. How you use the years ahead will determine whether you can ever make any amends for the lives you have taken and the pain you have caused. That journey begins today." The verdict and sentencing in the case of Dylan Terry sparked immediate and passionate debate throughout the legal system, media, and public consciousness, becoming a lightning rod for discussions about juvenile justice reform, family dynamics, mental health intervention, and the nature of evil itself. For the Terry parents, the outcome represented the devastating final chapter in a family tragedy that had unfolded with incomprehensible speed. In just 4 months, they had gone from being parents of 3 children to parents of none at home, with 2 buried in Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery, and one confined to the state's juvenile detention facility. As they left the courtroom for the final time, reporters shouted questions about their plans to visit Dylan or whether they felt justice had been served, queries they ignored as they walked silently to their car, two people inhabiting a new and unimaginable reality shaped by unthinkable loss and complicated grief. In newsrooms, legislative chambers, university classrooms, and dinner tables across the country, the case became a focal point for examining society's understanding of childhood, violence, accountability, and redemption, with the cryptic social media post that had led investigators to Dylan, sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen, emerging as a haunting emblem of the case that would be analyzed and referenced in countless articles, books, and studies in the years to come. In the months following Dylan Terry's sentencing, the case catalyzed significant changes in Ohio's juvenile justice system, beginning with a comprehensive review of protocols for identifying and intervening in cases of severe sibling rivalry and pathological jealousy. The Ohio Department of Youth Services established the Terry Intervention Protocol, a multidisciplinary approach requiring schools, healthcare providers, and social services to coordinate their observations and responses when children display warning signs of extreme jealousy or violent ideation toward family members. State Senator Gabriela Martinez, who had followed the case closely, sponsored legislation allocating $12 million for expanded mental health services in schools, with specific training for educators on recognizing and addressing the psychological dynamics that had contributed to the Terry tragedy. "We cannot bring back Sophia and Isabella," Martinez said during a press conference announcing the initiative, "but we can work to ensure that other families receive the intervention and support they need before another child's emotional distress escalates to violence." The bill passed with bipartisan support, a rare point of political consensus in recognition of the case's stark illustration of systemic failures to protect vulnerable children, both those who become victims of violence and those whose psychological distress transforms them into perpetrators. The legal implications of the case extended far beyond Ohio, influencing judicial approaches to juvenile defendants across the country as courts struggled to balance accountability with the neurobiological reality of adolescent brain development. The Terry case was cited in 27 subsequent rulings involving juvenile offenders during the following year alone, with judges often referencing Judge Blackwell's carefully articulated balance between punishment and rehabilitation. In Massachusetts, the state Supreme Court established new guidelines for evaluating criminal intent in defendants under 14, explicitly requiring consideration of developmental psychology in determining culpability. Law schools incorporated the case into their criminal justice curricula, using it to examine the intersection of legal, psychological, and ethical considerations in juvenile proceedings. Professor Evelyn Harris of Yale Law School published an influential analysis titled "The Forgotten Child Legal Paradoxes in the Dylan Terry Case," which became required reading for students specializing in juvenile justice, noting that the Terry case forces us to confront the fundamental tension in our legal system between chronological age and cognitive development, between punishment and rehabilitation, between protecting society and salvaging young lives that have gone catastrophically off course before they've truly begun. For James and Margaret Terry, the aftermath of the tragedy brought both personal devastation and an unexpected public role as advocates for family mental health awareness. After initially retreating from public view to grieve privately, the couple emerged 8 months after the sentencing to establish the Sophia and Isabella Foundation, dedicated to preventing family violence through early intervention in cases of severe sibling rivalry and parental differential treatment. "We cannot change our family's story," Margaret Terry said during the Foundation's launch event, her voice steady despite the visible weight of grief she carried. but we can help other families recognize the warning signs we missed and access the resources we didn't know to seek. The Foundation created educational materials for parents, teachers, and pediatricians about healthy sibling relationships and the warning signs of pathological jealousy, established support groups for parents navigating complex family dynamics, and funded research into effective interventions for children experiencing extreme resentment of siblings. James Terry, who had initially been more reluctant to speak publicly, gradually became an outspoken advocate for systemic change in how society approaches childhood mental health. We live in a culture that normalizes sibling rivalry to the point of blindness, he told attendees at a national conference on family psychology. We laugh about it in sitcoms, dismiss it as a normal part of growing up, and fail to recognize when it crosses the line from typical competition into dangerous territory. That cultural blindness cost our daughters their lives, and our son his future. Dylan Terry's experience in juvenile detention became a closely monitored case study in the rehabilitation of young offenders who have committed extreme acts of violence. Quarterly reports submitted to the court as required by his sentencing terms documented a slow, nonlinear progression through intensive psychological treatment, educational programming, and gradual development of emotional literacy and empathy. Dr. Raymond Foster, the lead psychologist assigned to Dylan's case, noted in his first-year assessment, "The patient presents a complex therapeutic challenge, as his cognitive understanding of his crimes has advanced more rapidly than his emotional processing of them. He can articulate what he did and why it was wrong in abstract terms, but still struggles to fully connect with the human reality of his sisters as individuals whose lives had value independent of their relationship to him." Progress reports noted improvements in Dylan's capacity for perspective-taking and emotional regulation, though therapists consistently identified empathy development as an ongoing challenge. At 14, Dylan began participating in a restorative justice program designed for juvenile offenders, though the specific details remained confidential due to his age and the high-profile nature of his case. Legal observers speculated about the eventual outcome of his mandated reassessment at 18, with opinions divided on whether rehabilitation was truly possible for a child who had committed such calculated violence, or whether the best society could hope for was effective containment of potential future harm. The broader cultural impact of the Terry case manifested in numerous ways, from academic research to popular media representations of childhood psychology and family dynamics. Dr. Elaine Matsuda, who had testified for the defense during the trial, published a groundbreaking study on the invisible child syndrome that tracked the psychological progression from perceived parental favoritism to pathological jealousy in siblings, identifying potential intervention points and therapeutic approaches. Her research, partly inspired by the Terry case, led to the development of new screening tools for pediatricians and school counselors to identify children at risk of developing dangerous levels of sibling resentment. The entertainment industry approached the case with both sensationalism and serious examination. A streaming documentary titled The Forgotten One Inside the Dylan Terry Case drew criticism for its exploitative approach, while a more nuanced fictional film, Invisible, used elements of the story to explore the psychological dynamics of a family unconsciously creating conditions for tragedy. Perhaps most significantly, parenting forums and family therapy practices reported increased awareness and concern about differential treatment of siblings, with parents seeking guidance on fostering healthy relationships among their children and recognizing warning signs of problematic jealousy before it escalated to harmful levels. The city of Cleveland itself grappled with the long shadow cast by the case, with the community divided between those who viewed Dylan Terry as a monster, deserving of the harshest possible punishment, and those who saw him as a symptom of broader societal failures to protect children's mental health. The site of the Terry home, which had been destroyed in the fire, remained an empty lot for 2 years before the neighborhood association raised funds to transform it into a small memorial garden dedicated to Sophia and Isabella. The garden featured 2 cherry trees that would bloom each spring, a small art installation inspired by Sophia's paintings, and a mathematics-themed puzzle path honoring Isabella's passion, a place of remembrance that acknowledged the girls' individuality and the potential lost with their deaths. Mercer Elementary established annual arts and mathematics scholarships in the sisters' names, ensuring their legacy would continue through opportunities provided to other children with similar talents and dreams. The community's healing process was complicated by the divisive nature of the case, with some residents arguing that memorializing the victims without acknowledging the systemic failures that created their killer represented an incomplete response to the tragedy. This tension played out in community forums, church discussions, and local media coverage, reflecting the broader national struggle to make meaning from a case that defied simple narratives of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, justice and mercy. 5 years after the fire that claimed Sophia and Isabella Terry's lives, the case continued to reverberate through legal, psychological, and cultural conversations about childhood, violence, and accountability. Scholars from diverse fields, criminal justice, developmental psychology, family systems therapy, neurobiology, continued to analyze the case as a profound example of the complex interplay between individual psychology, family dynamics, and societal responses to childhood violence. The phrase "forgotten one syndrome" entered the clinical lexicon, used to describe cases where a child's perception of being overlooked within the family system creates dangerous psychological distortions. The social media post that had led investigators to Dylan, sometimes the forgotten one remembers how to be seen, became a somber touchstone in discussions about digital literacy and the potential for social media to serve as both a warning system for mental health crises and a platform for expressing destructive intentions. As Dylan's 18th birthday approached, bringing with it the mandated reassessment that would determine his future placement in either adult corrections or supervised release programs, legal observers prepared for another wave of public attention to the case that had forced a painful national reckoning with the darkest potentials of childhood psychology and the limitations of a justice system designed for adult offenders faced with the reality of children who commit adult crimes.